There is a man in the Bible who appears without warning, without explanation, and without origin. In a book where every major figure is introduced through bloodlines and ancestry, where names are traced back generation by generation to the very dawn of humanity, this man simply materializes out of the ancient darkness, performs one of the most sacred acts in all of Scripture, and then disappears. His name is Melchizedek, and the silence that surrounds him is not an accident. Picture the scene. The dust has barely settled on one of the most decisive military victories of the ancient world. Abraham, the wandering patriarch, the man called by God out of Ur of the Chaldeans, has just led his trained men across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain to rescue his nephew Lot from the grip of 4 powerful kings. The battle is over. The prisoners are freed. The spoils are recovered. And in that charged, breathless moment of triumph, a figure emerges from the city of Salem. He carries bread. He carries wine. And he carries a title that should not belong to any single human being alive, king and priest at the same time. Abraham, the man to whom God had promised the entire world, immediately bows and offers him 1/10 of everything. Think about what that means. Abraham does not bow to kings. Abraham does not offer tribute to priests. This is the man who argued with God face to face, who stood his ground before the most powerful rulers of his age, who left behind the greatest civilization on earth because a voice told him to walk into the unknown. And yet, the moment he sees Melchizedek, something in him recognizes an authority that transcends everything he has ever encountered. No explanation is given. No background is provided. The text simply records the event and moves on, as if the author expects the reader to already know who this is, or perhaps as if the author deliberately chose not to say. The ancient world did not forget him. Centuries after Abraham walked away from that encounter in the valley of Shaveh, a king poet in Jerusalem wrote a single line that would shake the foundations of 2 world religions and ignite a theological controversy that has never been fully resolved. 1,000 years after that, a group of Jewish scholars hiding scrolls in the caves above the Dead Sea preserved fragments of a text that described Melchizedek not as a man, but as a heavenly being, a divine judge who would return at the end of days to execute the final judgment of God upon the earth. The rabbis argued over him. The early followers of Jesus built an entire theology around him. And still, the original text of Genesis offers nothing. Just a name, a title, a blessing, and silence. This is the story that was never supposed to need telling, because for those who encountered Melchizedek, no explanation was necessary. He was simply known. But somewhere across the centuries, the knowing was lost. What remained were fragments, a verse in Genesis, a line in a psalm, a passage in Hebrews that calls him a man without beginning or end of life. Pieces of a portrait that, when assembled with care, reveal something far more unsettling than a forgotten historical figure. They reveal a presence, a priesthood that did not begin with Aaron, did not end with the temple, and according to the oldest texts still in existence, has not ended yet. There are exactly 3 verses in the entire book of Genesis dedicated to one of the most mysterious figures in all of human history. 3 verses, not 3 chapters, not 3 pages, 3 verses. And in those 3 verses, a man appears out of nowhere, performs an act of profound spiritual authority over the father of 3 world religions, and then vanishes so completely that the text never mentions him again. No birth record, no death record, no family tree, no city of origin, no explanation whatsoever. His name is Melchizedek, and the fact that you have probably heard very little about him is itself one of the most important clues in this entire story. Open the book of Genesis chapter 14 and read it carefully. The setting is the aftermath of a regional war, a conflict between 4 kings and 5 kings that swept across the ancient Near East like a wildfire. Among the casualties of this war was Lot, the nephew of Abraham, who had been living in Sodom when the city was raided and its people taken captive. Abraham received the news, gathered 318 trained men from his own household, and launched a night raid that shattered the enemy coalition and recovered every prisoner and every piece of stolen property. It is a stunning military victory by any measure, and it is in the immediate aftermath of this victory, while Abraham is still standing in the valley of Shaveh, that the text delivers one of the most quietly astonishing moments in Scripture. A man walks out to meet him. That man is Melchizedek. The Hebrew text introduces him with a single dense sentence. He is described as the king of Salem and a priest of El Elyon, which translates as God Most High. He brings bread and wine. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him a tithe, 1/10 of everything recovered from the battle. And then the scene ends. The king of Sodom, who was also present and had his own claim on the spoils, gets more dialogue in the following verses than Melchizedek does in his entire appearance. The text treats this encounter as though it requires no explanation, as though any reader of the time would immediately understand who this figure is and why his blessing carries such extraordinary weight. But here is the problem. We do not understand. And the silence in the text is so complete, so deliberate, that scholars have been arguing about it for more than 2,000 years. Now stop and think about what the book of Genesis is. At its structural core, Genesis is obsessed with genealogy. It is a book that traces bloodlines with extraordinary precision. Chapter 5 gives you 10 generations from Adam to Noah, with the age of each patriarch at the birth of his firstborn son and the total span of his life. Chapter 10 maps the descendants of Noah's 3 sons across the known world. Chapter 11 traces the line from Shem to Abraham with the same meticulous detail. In the world of Genesis, identity is inseparable from ancestry. You are who your father was. You carry his name, his land, his blessing, and his covenant. To appear in Genesis without a genealogy is not just unusual. It is almost structurally impossible. It is like a footnote in a legal document that cites no source. And yet, there he stands, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, with no past attached to him whatsoever. The name itself is worth pausing on, because in the ancient Semitic world, names were not decorative, they were declarations. The Hebrew name Melchizedek is composed of 2 words, Melech meaning king, and tzedek, meaning righteousness. King of righteousness. That is not a personal name in the way we think of names today. It is a title, a proclamation, almost a theological statement embedded in a single word. And then his city, Salem. The root of that word in Hebrew is shalom, peace. So this figure, this man without origin, is simultaneously the king of righteousness and the king of peace. You ask yourself whether that combination of titles feels accidental. Ask yourself whether the author of Genesis, writing with extraordinary intentionality in every other detail of the text, simply chose those designations at random. The answer, when you sit with it, is obviously no. But here is where the mystery deepens in a direction most casual readers never follow. The dual title that Melchizedek holds, king and priest simultaneously, was not just unusual in ancient Israel, it was forbidden. The Mosaic law, established centuries after this encounter, drew an absolute line between the roles of king and priest. Kings came from the tribe of Judah. Priests came from the tribe of Levi. The two functions were kept rigorously separate, and any attempt to cross that boundary was treated as a catastrophic violation. When King Saul offered a sacrifice that should have been performed by the priest Samuel, it cost him his dynasty. When King Uzziah entered the temple to burn incense, a priestly act, he was immediately struck with leprosy and spent the rest of his life in isolation. The separation between king and priest was not a bureaucratic detail. It was a foundational pillar of the entire covenant structure of Israel. And yet, Melchizedek holds both offices simultaneously, without any indication in the text that this is controversial or problematic. No one objects. Abraham does not hesitate. God does not intervene to correct the situation. The combination of roles that would later be considered an abomination is here presented as natural, even authoritative. Guard that contradiction carefully, because it becomes the key that unlocks everything else in this story. Why would the text present a figure who violates, before the law even existed, one of the most sacred structural boundaries that the law would later establish? There are really only a few possible answers. Either the author of Genesis was describing something that predates the Mosaic categories entirely, something so ancient that the later rules simply did not apply to it. Or the author was deliberately pointing forward to a moment in history when those categories would be transcended, when someone would emerge who legitimately held both offices not in violation of the covenant, but in fulfillment of something even older. Or, and this is the possibility that has haunted Jewish and Christian theology for millennia, Melchizedek was never simply a human being operating within the normal boundaries of human history at all. The rabbis of the Second Temple period wrestled deeply with this figure. Some of them concluded that Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah, who, according to the genealogies of Genesis, would still have been alive during the time of Abraham. It was a tidy solution. It gave him a human identity and a biblical pedigree. It explained his extraordinary age and wisdom, and it resolved the uncomfortable absence of genealogical information by pointing to a genealogy that existed elsewhere in the text. But the solution created more problems than it solved, because the book of Hebrews, written in the first century of the Common Era, would make a claim about Melchizedek so radical, so deliberately provocative, that no genealogical explanation could contain it. A claim that he had no beginning of days and no end of life. A claim that his priesthood was not passed on to successors because it never ended. A claim that would reshape the entire theological architecture of the ancient world, and that we will examine in precise detail as this story unfolds. For now, hold on to this. A man walks out of a city that does not yet have its famous name, meets the most important patriarch in the biblical narrative at the peak of his military triumph, blesses him in the name of God Most High, receives a tithe from him in return, and disappears without explanation. 3 verses, no genealogy, no origin, no ending. The Bible introduces him, and then, for 1,000 years of recorded scripture, says nothing more. And the silence is so loud, so carefully constructed, that it can only mean one thing. This is not a story about someone the text forgot to explain. This is a story about someone the text is not yet ready to fully reveal. Before we go any further, we need to slow down and sit inside that valley for a moment, not rush past it the way most Bible readers do, scanning the lines, noting the name, moving on to the next story, because what happened in the valley of Shaveh, just outside the ancient city of Salem, was not a casual diplomatic exchange between 2 regional leaders. It was an encounter so theologically loaded, so deliberately constructed in the text, that every single word in those 3 verses is carrying weight that most modern readers are completely unequipped to feel. And to feel it properly, we need to go back to the original Hebrew and ask 2 very simple questions that almost no one stops to ask. King of what, exactly, and priest of whom, precisely? Let us begin with the city, Salem. The text tells us that Melchizedek is the king of Salem, and most readers who have spent any time in Scripture immediately assume that Salem is an early name for Jerusalem. The connection is ancient. The historian Josephus made it in the 1st century, and it became the dominant reading in both Jewish and Christian tradition. The Hebrew root is unmistakable. Salem shares its core letters with shalom, the Hebrew word for peace that goes far beyond the English translation. Shalom does not simply mean the absence of conflict. It means wholeness, completeness, a state of perfect alignment between all things. So when the text tells you that Melchizedek is the king of Salem, it is not giving you a geographical address. It is handing you a theological portrait. This man rules over peace, over the condition of total wholeness that the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis to Revelation, to straining toward, that is the city he governs. That is the of his kingdom. Now look at his priestly title. The text in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, calls him a priest of El Elyon. In the Hebrew tradition, El is one of the oldest and most fundamental names for the divine. It predates the specific covenant name revealed to Moses and carries a universal quality that the later names do not. Elyon means most high, supreme, elevated above all other powers and authorities. So El Elyon is not a tribal deity, not the god of a particular people or a particular land. El Elyon is the creator of heaven and earth. And Melchizedek himself uses that exact phrase when he blesses Abraham in verse 19. He says, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth." Notice something extraordinary here. Abraham does not correct him. Abraham does not say, "That is not my God's name," or "I serve a different deity." Abraham immediately and completely accepts the blessing, and then, in his response to the king of Sodom, he himself uses the title El Elyon to describe the God he serves. In that moment, Abraham is confirming that the God Melchizedek serves and the God Abraham serves are one and the same. This stranger from Salem, this man with no genealogy and no explanation, is a priest of the very God who called Abraham out of Ur and promised him the world. Now hold those two titles together, King of Righteousness and King of Peace, priest of the universal Creator God, and ask yourself what kind of human being could legitimately carry them both at the same time. In the ancient Near East, the combination of king and priest in a single person was not unheard of. Babylonian and Egyptian rulers sometimes claimed priestly functions. But in the specific theological framework of the Hebrew Scriptures, those two roles were kept apart with an almost fierce intentionality. The king represented political and military authority rooted in the people, subject to the covenant law. The priest represented access to the divine, rooted in bloodline, functioning as a mediator between God and humanity. One moved horizontally through history, the other moved vertically toward heaven. For both functions to exist simultaneously in a single person, without any violation of the divine order, that person would have to be something the system of human categories was not designed to contain. And then there is the bread and the wine. Most readers glide past this detail as though it were simply hospitality, as though Melchizedek brought refreshments for tired soldiers returning from battle. But bread and wine in the ancient Semitic world were not casual provisions. They were the fundamental elements of covenant meals, of sacred feasts, of offerings presented before the divine. When a priest brought bread and wine, he was not catering an event. He was performing a ritual act, a sacerdotal function, an officiation of something holy. Centuries later, at the last meal Jesus shared with his disciples before his death, he took bread and wine and assigned them a meaning that would reverberate through all of subsequent history. Whether or not you hold a theological position on what that meal means, the structural parallel is impossible to ignore. The first priest of El Elyon mentioned in the Bible brings bread and wine to bless the father of the faithful. The one who would later be called a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek takes bread and wine to seal a new covenant with his own blood. These are not coincidences scattered carelessly across the text. This is architecture. But the detail in the encounter that carries perhaps the most explosive theological charge is the tithe. Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything. In the later Mosaic system, the tithe was given to the Levitical priests as compensation for their service at the sanctuary. Because the tribe of Levi received no territorial inheritance in the Promised Land and depended on the offerings of the other tribes for their sustenance. The tithe was a mechanism of the covenant economy, a way of honoring the priestly class and sustaining the worship system. But here, centuries before Moses, centuries before the tribe of Levi even exists, the greatest patriarch in the Hebrew tradition gives a tithe to a priest who has no Levitical credentials whatsoever. Abraham, who is himself the ancestor of every future Israelite, of every future Levite, out of every future priest who will ever serve at the altar in Jerusalem, that Abraham bows before Melchizedek and offers him a tenth of everything. The book of Hebrews in chapter 7 will make the staggering logical implication of this act absolutely explicit, since Levi was, in a biological sense, still inside the body of Abraham when this tithe was paid. Levi himself paid a tithe to Melchizedek. The lesser was blessed by the greater. The entire Levitical priesthood, the most powerful religious institution in Israelite history, was in that moment subordinated to an older and higher order. Guard that idea carefully, because it is the thread that connects everything. There is a priesthood older than Aaron, older than Moses, older than the covenant at Sinai. A priesthood that was functioning, that was legitimate, that was recognized by God and honored by Abraham long before the structures of Israel even existed. And it belonged to a man who came from a city whose name means peace, who bore a name that means righteousness, who served the Creator of heaven and earth, and who brought bread and wine to seal a blessing that would echo across 4,000 years of human history. The question is not whether this priesthood is significant. The question, the one that will push us deeper into the most controversial corners of ancient theology, is whether it ever actually ended. 1,000 years of silence. That is how long the Hebrew Scriptures say nothing more about Melchizedek after Genesis chapter 14. 1,000 years during which Israel is born as a nation, receives the law at Sinai, wanders in the wilderness, conquers the promised land, cycles through judges and wars and famines and revivals, and builds a monarchy that rises to the height of its glory under a shepherd king from Bethlehem named David. 1,000 years of covenant history, of priesthood and sacrifice, of the Levitical system operating at full strength. And Melchizedek is mentioned nowhere. Not in Exodus, not in Leviticus, not in Numbers, not in Deuteronomy, not in the books of history, not in the writings of the prophets. He disappears after Genesis 14 as completely as he appeared. And the silence stretches across 10 centuries like a held breath, and then, in a single line buried inside a royal psalm, he comes back. And when he does, nothing in the theology of Israel is ever the same again. The psalm is Psalm 110. It is attributed to David, and it is one of the most quoted texts from the Hebrew Scriptures in the entire New Testament, cited more frequently by the authors of the Gospels and the letters than almost any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. The psalm is structured as a prophetic oracle, a divine declaration addressed to someone David calls "my Lord." It describes this figure as a king enthroned at the right hand of God, as a military conqueror whose enemies are made a footstool beneath his feet, as a ruler who will judge nations and shatter kings on the day of his wrath. The imagery is volcanic, the language is cosmic, and the religious establishment of Jerusalem would have recognized immediately that David was describing someone whose authority exceeded any merely human king. But it is verse 4 that lands like a thunderclap. God himself speaks in that verse, directly, without metaphor, sealed with an oath, and says, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Let those words settle for a moment, because they are doing several impossible things at once. First, God is declaring that the figure David calls "my Lord" is a priest, not just a king, a priest, which means this coming ruler will hold both offices simultaneously, exactly as Melchizedek did. Second, this priesthood is described as eternal, forever, which means it does not operate by the rules of the Levitical system, where priests served for a defined period, aged out of active duty, and were replaced by their sons. Third, God declares this with an oath. The Hebrew text uses the phrase, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind," which is an extraordinary formulation. There are very few moments in the entire Hebrew Bible where God binds himself with an oath of this weight. And fourth, by invoking Melchizedek specifically, the psalm is reaching back across 1,000 years of silence and saying that encounter in the valley of Shaveh was not a footnote. It was a template. It was a preview of something that had not yet fully arrived. Now think about what this meant to the people who first heard it. David was the king of Israel. He ruled from Jerusalem, the city that was almost certainly the same Salem where Melchizedek had once reigned. David had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, establishing it as the spiritual center of the nation. He had danced before the Lord in the streets of the city. He had written psalms that became the liturgy of the temple. And he had received a covenant from God promising that one of his descendants would reign on his throne forever. David was the most theologically significant king in Israel's history. And David is writing a psalm about someone he calls my Lord, someone greater than himself, and declaring that this person will be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He is not describing himself. He is pointing forward. He is saying, there is coming someone who will fulfill what Melchizedek began, someone in whom the King of righteousness and the King of peace will finally, completely, permanently converge. The religious establishment of the Second Temple period found this psalm deeply uncomfortable, and the discomfort is visible in the rabbinic literature of that era. If the coming Messiah was to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek, what did that mean for the Levitical priests who held the institutional power of the temple? If there was an older, higher priesthood to which even Abraham had submitted, did the elaborate sacrificial system of the Mosaic law represent the final word on how humanity approached God, or was it always meant to be temporary, a placeholder until the older order was restored? These were not abstract theological questions. They were questions with enormous political and economic implications because the temple priesthood in Jerusalem was one of the most powerful institutions in the ancient world, but controlling vast resources, mediating the relationship between the Jewish people and their God, and deriving its entire legitimacy from the bloodline of Aaron and the tribe of Levi. Psalm 110, if taken seriously, was a slow-burning challenge to all of that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran in the mid-20th century, revealed just how seriously some Jewish communities were taking that challenge in the centuries before the Common Era. Among the scrolls was a fragmentary text now known as the Melchizedek document, or 11Q13, a remarkable piece of writing that draws on Psalm 110 and several passages from the prophets to present Melchizedek not as a historical figure from the past, but as a heavenly being who would appear at the end of days. The text describes him as a divine judge who will proclaim liberty to the captives, execute judgment on the forces of evil, and atone for the sins of the people of God. The language used for Melchizedek in this document is language that elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures is reserved exclusively for God himself. Whoever wrote the Melchizedek document believed that the figure glimpsed so briefly in Genesis 14 was not a man who had lived and died in the ancient world. They believed he was a celestial being who was still active, still present, and still coming. And here is what most people miss when they read the story of Jesus through the lens of the Gospels alone. The earliest followers of Jesus did not primarily understand him as a moral teacher or even as a miracle worker. They understood him as the fulfillment of Psalm 110. The question Jesus himself asks the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 22, if the Messiah is David's son, how can David call him Lord? Is a direct reference to the opening line of that psalm. Jesus is pointing to it deliberately, forcing his listeners to confront its implications. He is saying, you know this psalm, you have read it, you have sung it. Now tell me how a son can be greater than his father, how a descendant can be the Lord of his ancestor. The Pharisees, the text tells us, had no answer, because the answer required accepting something that the entire existing religious structure was not built to accommodate. That the priesthood of Melchizedek had returned, that the order older than Aaron had been restored, and that the silence of 1,000 years had finally been broken not by a new institution, but by a person. There is a sentence in the New Testament that has disturbed careful readers for 2,000 years. It is not a sentence about miracles or resurrections or cosmic judgment. It is a sentence about a man's family history, or rather, about the complete absence of one. It appears in the 7th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews, and it describes Melchizedek in terms so radical, so theologically destabilizing, that generations of scholars have devoted entire careers to debating what it actually means. The text says that Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Read that again slowly, not simply that his genealogy is unrecorded, not that his parents are unknown, without beginning of days, without end of life. The author of Hebrews is not describing a gap in the historical record. He is describing something that exists outside the boundaries of normal human existence entirely. Now, before we go further, we need to be precise about what the author of Hebrews is actually arguing, because this passage is one of the most frequently misread in all of Scripture. Some interpreters claim that the author is only making a literary or typological point, that because the Genesis text does not mention Melchizedek's birth or death, he functions symbolically as a figure of eternal priesthood without the author intending any claim about his actual. That reading is comfortable. It keeps Melchizedek safely within the category of ordinary humanity while still allowing the theological point about eternal priesthood to stand. But it requires ignoring the specific and deliberate language the author chooses, and it requires explaining away a phrase, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, that in every other context in the Greek of that era describes something genuinely without temporal origin or conclusion. The author of Hebrews was not a careless writer. He was one of the most sophisticated theological minds of the first century. When he chose those words, he chose them with precision. So what are the real options on the table? The first and oldest theory, embraced by many of the early rabbis, is that Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah. According to the genealogies of Genesis, Shem lived for 600 years, and if you calculate the chronology carefully, he would still have been alive during the period of Abraham's life. And Shem was the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, a survivor of the Great Flood, a man who would have carried the pre-Diluvian knowledge of God's ways across the catastrophe of the world's destruction. The theory has a certain elegance to it. It gives Melchizedek a human identity, connects him to the most significant events in early biblical history and explains his extraordinary authority without requiring any supernatural category. But the author of Hebrews almost certainly knew this tradition, and he still wrote what he wrote. He still said, without father, without mother, without genealogy, if Melchizedek were Shem, that statement would be not just imprecise, but actively false. Shem has an extremely well-documented genealogy in Genesis. The second major theory is that Melchizedek was a theophany, a physical appearance of God himself, or more specifically, of the pre-incarnate Christ, the eternal Son of God appearing in human form before his incarnation in Bethlehem. This is not a fringe reading. It was held by several significant voices in early Christian theology, and it has the considerable advantage of taking the language of Hebrews at full face value. If this figure truly has no beginning of days and no end of life, then he is by definition not a created being operating within time. He is something that exists prior to and beyond the temporal order. The early church had already identified several moments in Genesis where a mysterious figure appears. The angel of the Lord who wrestles with Jacob, the commander of the Lord's army who appears to Joshua, the fourth figure in Nebuchadnezzar's furnace who looks like a son of the gods, and argued that these were appearances of the pre-incarnate Christ moving through history before his permanent entry into it at Bethlehem. Melchizedek, on this reading, belongs to that same category. He is not a man pointing to Christ. He is Christ appearing in history at a pivotal moment to bless and commission the Father of the faithful. The third theory, which surfaces in Jewish apocalyptic literature and finds its fullest expression in the Dead Sea Scroll fragment we discussed earlier, is that Melchizedek is an angelic or celestial being of the highest order, a heavenly high priest who serves in the divine throne room and who makes occasional interventions into human history. This reading draws on the broader angelology of Second Temple Judaism, which had developed a rich and complex understanding of heavenly beings who held specific offices and functions in the divine administration of the cosmos. In this framework, Melchizedek is not God himself, but he is far above any human category, a created being of immense power and holiness, assigned to the role of heavenly high priest, whose brief appearance to Abraham was a moment of intersection between the celestial and earthly orders. This is the Melchizedek of 11Q13, the eschatological judge who will return at the end of days to execute the final liberation of God's people. What is extraordinary is that the author of Hebrews seems to be aware of all three traditions and deliberately constructs his argument to transcend them. He does not settle the question of Melchizedek's precise. Instead, he uses the unresolved mystery of the figure as a mirror. He holds it up to reflect the of Jesus and says, whatever Melchizedek was, Jesus is that, completely and permanently. Where Melchizedek appeared to be without genealogy, Jesus actually and ontologically exists before all genealogy. Where Melchizedek seemed to have no end of life, Jesus literally conquered death and lives in the power of an indestructible life. The exact phrase the author uses in chapter 7, verse 16. Where Melchizedek's priesthood had no recorded successor, Jesus holds his priesthood permanently because he never dies. He is not like Melchizedek in the way that a symbol resembles its referent. He is the reality that Melchizedek was always previewing. And this is where the argument of Hebrews reaches its most destabilizing conclusion, one that would have been received by its original Jewish audience as either the most profound insight in the history of their theology or the most dangerous blasphemy imaginable. The author says explicitly in chapter 7, verse 11, "If perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, and the people received the law under it, why was there still a need for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than after the order of Aaron?" The logic is airtight and devastating. If the Levitical system had been the final and complete answer to the problem of humanity's separation from God, Psalm 110 would never have been written. David would have had no reason to invoke an older, higher order. The very existence of that psalm is, for the author of Hebrews, proof that the Levitical priesthood was always a temporary measure, always a shadow cast by something more real that was still coming. And what was coming had a name that was, in the deepest possible sense, the fulfillment of a title first spoken in a valley outside a city called Peace, by a man who had no beginning and no end. To understand what was truly at stake in the argument about Melchizedek, you need to understand what the Levitical priesthood actually was in the ancient world. This was not a quiet religious institution tucked into the corner of Israelite society. It was an empire within an empire, a self-sustaining system of extraordinary power, wealth, and cultural authority that had been operating continuously for over 1,000 years. By the time the first century arrived, the temple in Jerusalem, rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great into one of the most spectacular structures in the ancient world, employed thousands of priests, Levites, and temple servants. It controlled the sacrificial economy of an entire people, received tithes and offerings from Jewish communities spread across the known world, and served as the irreplaceable mediator between Israel and its God. To challenge the Levitical priesthood was not a theological abstraction. It was a declaration of institutional war. And yet, that is precisely what the argument from Melchizedek did. The author of Hebrews understood this perfectly, and he built his case with the methodical precision of a prosecuting attorney who knows that his argument will be resisted with every available weapon. He begins in chapter 7 by establishing the historical priority of Melchizedek's order over Levi's, using the tithe paid by Abraham and the logic we explored earlier to demonstrate that the greater always blesses the lesser, and that Levi was, in a real sense, subordinate to Melchizedek before Levi even existed. Then he moves to the psalm, using David's invocation of the Melchizedek order as proof from within Israel's own sacred texts that the Levitical system was never the final destination. And then he delivers the argument that would have landed in the ears of his Jewish readers like a controlled demolition. When the priesthood changes, the law changes with it. Everything built on the foundation of the Levitical system, the sacrifices, the rituals, the entire framework of approach to God, was not the permanent structure. It was the scaffolding around something being built. The word the author uses in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12 is the Greek word metathesis, a transfer, a transposition, a fundamental change of order. He is not saying that the old system was wrong or evil or without value. He is saying that it was always designed to point beyond itself, and that the moment the reality arrived, the shadow had fulfilled its purpose. This is the argument that tore the early Jewish Christian community down the middle. For Jews who had not accepted Jesus as the Messiah, the claim was incomprehensible and offensive. The law of Moses was eternal, given directly by God at Sinai, and no subsequent figure, however impressive, could simply declare it superseded. For the early followers of Jesus, who had come from a Jewish background, the argument required a complete and painful reconceptualization of everything they had been taught to hold sacred since childhood. The priesthood was not merely being reformed, it was being replaced, and the replacement was not a new institution at all. It was the restoration of something far older. Now, here is where the story opens outward in a direction that most people never follow, because the implications of the Melchizedek order were not contained within the pages of the letter to the Hebrews. They spread through the entire early Christian movement and generated conflicts that shaped the history of the Western world for centuries. The question of priestly authority, who has legitimate access to God on behalf of the people and on what basis, is not an ancient question that was settled long ago. It is the question that drove the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, when reformers argued that the Roman Catholic priesthood had reconstructed a Levitical model that the letter to the Hebrews had declared obsolete. It is the question that underlies every debate about institutional religion versus direct spiritual access. And it traces back, in every case, to that encounter in the valley of Shaveh, to a man with bread and wine and a title that no single human being should have been able to carry. But we need to go further still, because the Dead Sea Scrolls opened a door that academic scholarship has been walking through slowly and carefully for decades, and what lies on the other side of that door is genuinely astonishing. The community at Qumran, the group of Jewish sectarians who preserved the scrolls in caves above the Dead Sea sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, had developed a theology of Melchizedek that went far beyond anything in the canonical texts. In their understanding, the celestial Melchizedek was the chief of the heavenly host, a being of divine light who stood in direct opposition to a figure they called Melchizedek, the king of wickedness. The cosmic war between these two figures was not metaphor for the Qumran community. It was the actual structure of reality, the framework within which all of human history was being played out. And the arrival of the eschatological Melchizedek, the heavenly priest-king returning to execute judgment, was the event they were living in anticipation of, the reason they had withdrawn from the corrupt temple establishment in Jerusalem and were waiting in the desert for the end of the age. Connect that to what Jesus said in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. The Pharisees respond with incredulity. Jesus is not yet 50 years old. How could he have seen Abraham? And Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. That phrase, I am, is not a grammatical error in the Greek text. It is the present tense applied to existence before time, the same formulation used for the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Jesus is not claiming to be older than Abraham in the way that a very long-lived person is older than a younger one. He is claiming to exist in a category that the normal measurement of time does not apply to. He is claiming, in the most direct language available to him, to be the one who was present in that valley outside Salem, the one who brought bread and wine, the one without beginning of days or end of life, The audience understood exactly what he was claiming, which is why the text immediately tells us they picked up stones to kill him. The order of Melchizedek did not replace the Levitical empire through political maneuvering or institutional reform or military conquest. It replaced it the way the sun replaces a candle, not by extinguishing it forcibly, but simply by arriving. The candle was never meant to be the final source of light. It was always meant to make darkness bearable until the morning came. And the morning, when it finally came, looked nothing like the religious establishment had expected. It did not arrive with a genealogy from Aaron. It did not arrive with temple credentials or Levitical bloodlines. It arrived from a city whose name means peace, bearing bread and wine, with a priesthood that the law had never created and therefore could never cancel. A priesthood after an order so ancient that even Abraham, standing at the very beginning of the covenant story, already recognized it as something greater than himself. We have traveled a long distance together through this story, from a valley outside an ancient city, through 1,000 years of silence, through a single explosive line in a royal psalm, through the most radical claims in the letter to the Hebrews, through the caves of Qumran and the theological wars of the early centuries. And now we arrive at the question that all of this has been building toward. Not a historical question, not an academic question, a present tense question aimed directly at the world you are living in right now. If the priesthood of Melchizedek is eternal, if the one who holds it lives in the power of an indestructible life, if his intercession never stops and his order never passes to a successor, then what is happening right now at this moment in the unseen architecture of reality? The answer to that question is not tucked safely in the ancient past. It is unfolding in real time, and it has everything to do with where history is heading. The letter to the Hebrews, in chapter 7, verse 25, makes one of the most quietly staggering claims in all of Scripture. It says that Jesus always lives to make intercession for those who come to God through him. Not that he made intercession once, historically, on a cross outside Jerusalem. Not that he left behind a system or an institution to carry on that function after his departure. He always lives, present tense, continuous tense, without interruption or limitation, to intercede. The Greek word translated as always is pantot, meaning at all times, in every circumstance, without exception. The priesthood that began, or rather that was previewed, in that encounter with Abraham, has never ceased its operation. It was functioning before the Mosaic law existed. It continued functioning while the Levitical system ran its course. It is functioning now, in this present moment, while you are listening to these words. That is not a theological abstraction. That is a claim about the current state of the cosmos. Now connect that to something Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, that most people have heard, but very few have followed to its full implication. His disciples ask him about the signs of the end of the age, and he gives them a list of conditions: wars, famines, earthquakes, the rise of false prophets, the love of many growing cold. And then, embedded in the middle of that list, he says something that reaches directly back to the very beginning of the biblical story. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. He is not making a passing metaphor. He is drawing a direct structural parallel between two specific moments in history: the world before the flood and the world before his return. And the days of Noah, as we have seen, were days defined by the blurring of boundaries, the corruption of created order, the infiltration of spiritual forces into the physical world, and the extraordinary advancement of human civilization in directions that God ultimately judged as irredeemable. Look at our world today with that framework in mind, and ask yourself honestly whether the parallel feels distant or uncomfortably close. We live in a moment when human beings have gained the ability to rewrite the genetic code of living organisms, including ourselves. The technology called CRISPR, developed in the early 21st century, allows scientists to edit the DNA of human embryos with a precision that was unimaginable a generation ago. Designer characteristics, engineered enhancements, the deliberate alteration of what it means to be biologically human. These are not fiction scenarios. They are current events, debated in research papers and ethics committees and government hearings right now. We live in a moment of unprecedented spiritual confusion, where the boundaries between the material and the supernatural are being deliberately blurred from multiple directions simultaneously, through technology, through pharmacology, or through the mainstreaming of occult practices that previous generations would have recognized immediately as the same forces the ancient texts warned about. Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah. The days of Noah were not ordinary times of ordinary human sinfulness. They were a specific kind of crisis, a crisis of category, of boundary, of the corruption of the created order at its most fundamental level. Does that description feel familiar? But here is what the story of Melchizedek adds to that picture that nothing else in Scripture quite provides. In the middle of the most chaotic and violent period in the pre-flood world, God was not absent. The order of righteousness and peace was not dormant. Somewhere in the ancient world, in a city whose name declared the wholeness that everything around it was losing, a priest king was serving El Elyon, the creator of heaven and earth, and maintaining a line of genuine worship and genuine access to God that the corruption of the age had not extinguished. When Abraham walked out of the destruction of the war-ravaged plain and into the valley of Shaveh, the first thing that met him was not a demand, not a judgment, not a condemnation. It was bread. It was wine. It was a blessing spoken by someone who recognized in him a man through whom God intended to restore what had been broken. The eternal priesthood did not wait for the world to clean itself up before it extended grace. It met the patriarch at the boundary of the battlefield and blessed him there, covered in the dust of a world at war.